Io chiamerei adesso qui i due discussant, Emmanuel Mourlon-Druol e Giuliano Garavini.
Ecco, funziona bene. Buongiorno e grazie agli organizzatori per l'invito. Quindi tocca a un francese di commentare un paper che parla della Francia e anche l'altro che è abbastanza legato alla Francia, purtroppo spero di no. I'm switching to English because that might be more useful for some of the comments. So I'll start with Juliana. I greatly enjoyed your paper. It's really interesting, and I actually look forward to reading the book when it comes out and to hear more about it. My comments are of two sorts, one more related to the domestic aspect of your story and one perhaps to the European aspect of your story. On the domestic aspect, reading the paper and also hearing your presentation, obviously, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the personal level. So you mentioned the several big names, Mourlon, Rocard, Mitterrand. In places in the paper, you mentioned advisors of Mourlon that were closer to the line of Rocard, but who were they exactly? Will you be looking at them, and how important was their role? Who else than Rocard actually himself was belonging to this sort of alternative vision? And the other aspect that is, I think, more domestic that I wanted to ask you is I wondered whether you can make more of the difference of views that existed about nationalization between Mitterrand and Rocard. I mean that in the sense that, to my understanding, and at least I think retrospectively, I don't know if it was what he was arguing at the time, Rocard always meant that he was not necessarily against nationalizations per se, he was against the way in which they happened, so namely buying 100% of the companies, and he was meaning, again, at least retrospectively, that it could have been done 15% plus one of the shares. Is that correct, or what could we make of that statement that he made retrospectively? On the European dimension, I wanted to ask you what sort of impact this discussion had on the visions of European integration, because there's a complex story here between, obviously, the connections with Europe in 1983, but also before that and how they may view European integration. Actually, funnily, I didn't mean to ask this question before I read the paper. It's in reading the paper and actually most worrying of all, reading a footnote, that I thought of that question, because you mentioned at one point one comment from a World Bank person, and I was intrigued who that World Bank person could be, and that World Bank person turned out to be Bella Balassa, who's actually very important for European integration when he published his article in the 1950s, if memory serves, on the theories of European integration. And so connecting these, I started thinking, well, the question of nationalization can have a bearing on the visions of European integration that these people have. So I wanted to ask you whether you could elaborate on that and more, or even whether at all that was relevant. And the second related aspect was, so in your presentation, you mentioned several aspects related to primary sources, but precisely concerning the question of Europe, I wanted to ask you what other sources you planned or wanted to use. So would you be interested in using sources about European meetings, about Council of Ministers of Finance, and how they project their vision of what's happening in France in the Council of Ministers of Finance, or in the European Council, if we are thinking about Mitterrand, obviously, or even in bilateral encounters, whenever, as and when that can be relevant. And now turning to Mélanie's paper, I also greatly enjoyed it. That's a really interesting contribution to a better understanding, not only of the substance of what you're looking at, but also of the whole process of institutionalization in Europe. And here I must apologize that I haven't read the book, but it was on my reading list, but I look forward to reading it to learn more. the questions I had first a question about the whole notion that you explore and the fact that the public economy and the private sector are not aligned in the first place. And I wanted to ask you, probably I sensed what the answer is, but why in the first place they are not aligned, and what is the justification of having very different systems and contexts for what is the public economy and for what is the private sector? The other point I wanted to ask you was about the actors. So it's clear in your paper that you mentioned a lot the CEP and that it is an important actor. At least in the paper, obviously I imagine it's different in the book, but you don't really talk about specific positions of member states or their interactions or individuals. So I wanted to ask you, is this a correct impression I have from the paper or for your analysis in the book? And if not, what do you think is the overall picture between the balance of the member states, the Commission, the different committees that can exist, the role of the European Parliament, the role of other institutions in Europe? And my last point was related actually to the two questions that you asked at the beginning of your presentation, at the beginning of your paper, which I think are really important, really a great way of putting forward what you're going to explore in more detail in the rest of the paper. But frustratingly, in a way, you don't answer them. So I wanted to ask you two questions. Is it Europe that ordered the privatizations? And the other one. But then my question is not just rhetorically, so I wanted also to check with you that my understanding is correct. So to your first question, is it Europe that ordered the privatization? My understanding when reading you is that not really. Not really, because you carefully, in the way you phrase your question, that's why I think it's a really useful question, you put Europe in inverted commas. And the whole bulk of what you're demonstrating is precisely to unpack the notion of Europe and how it influenced the question of privatization. So my own answer in my reading to your first question would tend to be no, or at least it's much more complicated than that. So I would be happy to know whether I'm reading you correctly or not. And then on the second question, is it in Brussels that the crisis in French-Thai public service has been played out? Well, the answer is a bit the same. When I read you, it's not really, because here you unpack, and that's the other very important contribution, you unpack Brussels. I mean, these two stereotypes, Europe and Brussels, don't mean anything. And here you unpack that and you show that it's not really in Brussels that the crisis played out, and it's in many other forums, because you describe that complex institutionalization, because you describe that, and you analyze, that Brussels is not just the Commission, it's also the CEP, other actors. So here again, my reading is that it tends to be a no answer to that second question. So to be more sophisticated, my question here would be, is my understanding of your answer to these two questions correct or not? And thank you again to the both of you for your great presentations and papers.